First of all, I want to thank everyone from on behalf of Plato. So we're the host of the webinar. We host these webinars and kind of ask me anything sessions so that people in our community and even new members of our community can hear from our mentors. And in case you're not familiar with us, so Plato is a mentorship platform. So if you're an engineering leader and you want to become a better manager, a better leader, we're here for you. So we actually help you find a long-term mentor. And we're lucky enough to have Brett. He's a manager at Atlassian, so he's one of our mentors, and he'll be answering questions. And we host these webinars with some of our friends. And today we have our friends from Andela who are going to be supporting us. And we have their CTO, David, who's going to be asking some initial questions. He'll also be presenting kind of his thoughts as well on this topic. So he'll be interviewing and he'll be talking to Brett. And then we'll also turn to you to to our listeners here. So feel free to ask questions. I would recommend, so really appreciate everyone saying hello on the chat, but then we also recommend that you use the Q&A feature to actually submit questions. And I also have some questions that people submitted over email to me, so I appreciate that. And let's turn it over now to David and Brett so they can share their thoughts. So David, if you want to kick it off.
Great. Thanks, Mustafa. Appreciate it. So welcome aboard, everyone. I'm dialing in from my home in Nairobi, Kenya, and I've been working for Andela for a year and a half now. And I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to be here with everyone on the call, especially Brett as our keynote here. And looking forward to having a great discussion around distributed engineering or remote. We use those words interchangeably. I think both Brett and myself have experienced some really good success with this approach to working. And so I think it makes sense to maybe set up the topic a little bit, and I'll do that with a little bit of data, and then get into a little bit of my background in Andela, and then obviously turn it over to Brett to talk about his background so that you at least have some context of where we're coming from as practitioners of distributed and remote engineering practices. So as most people know, distributed engineering and offering a remote work experience is really emerging in the marketplace. And from my experience, it's been a great way to recruit and find the right talent that you need to support your roadmaps, to support development. And so, there's lots of data out there, data from Stack Overflow and Upwork and various other sites that sort of indicate that, 45% of software engineers want to work remotely. This is an emerging trend. People are already working from home offices or shared spaces and want that flexibility. And it's just a growing trend. And so, we address people who are looking to recruit for our teams is looking for it. This is something we should definitely consider. In terms of myself and my background, and maybe just to set up Andela a little bit so that you have some context, I've worked at large software companies. I've worked at medium-sized SaaS companies like LogMeIn that was going through explosive growth. I went to a startup of 60 people, and competing as a startup to try to find the right talent to build your teams, because we know that talent is just, that's really what we need to be successful in the software industry, was offering a remote experience. I had held meetups to try to recruit people. I paid recruiters ridiculous amounts of money. I had chased the local press to see who was going out of business or being acquired. And one of the best things that I found in my experience was offering a remote experience to get that talent that was needed to execute on our product plans. And so it's something that I've really resonated. And then in terms of Andela, when I came here, one of the things that drew me to Andela was the idea of solving the talent problem in a different way. And the problem space really spoke to me. And the way that Andela delivers its service is by delivering remote software engineers from our offices and from home locations around mostly the continent of Africa. This is how we deliver our service. We have 1,200 engineers, and they are working at companies mostly in North America and Europe in terms of delivering great engineering work. And we have really implemented a lot of best practices to make it work, in terms of sending people on site to build rapport, in terms of great onboarding checklists, in terms of using technology and best practices. And we'll get into all of that. But Not only have I been a practitioner of building and leading remote engineering teams, I'm also at a company which is how we deliver our service. And so that's a little bit about Andela, and we're happy to share more about it. We have some collateral that we can share, but I wanted to just kind of give everyone some context. So that's a little bit about me and sort of why I'm here and happy to host. Why don't I turn it over to Brett and let him give, an introduction of himself, and so that you can all have some context of, his point of view and where he's coming from.
Thanks, and great to be here. Happy to be able to be on this webinar and help people learn some of the lessons that I've had to learn the hard way. I got introduced to remote work through a couple of bigger companies that really kind of used it as a way to make sure that employees would be available when we needed to be. It was not used as a convenience or a perk for the employees. And then about 5.5 years ago, I transitioned to full-time remote, more as this is the way we work, instead of just we want people to be available. That's when I started working at Fog Creek Software, which is the company where Stack Overflow and Trello both came from. But I started working there full-time remote as a developer, and then quickly moved into management because I had that aptitude. And so I've been a full-time remote manager for the last 5 years.
Great. Well, thank you for that. So Brett, I want to dig in now to kind of exposing some of these lessons learned, and maybe it makes sense with starting with the idea of, how did you get started with the idea of a remote team, and maybe it was at Trello where it really took hold, but we'd love to just understand, like, what was the motivation for you to go this route, and then what were some of the early steps you took to get started?
When I started my transition, I was working at Goldman Sachs, and I was doing an 1.5-hour commute each direction to get to and from work. And so I felt like I never saw my family. Other responsibilities that I had outside of work just kind of contributed to not seeing any of my kids. And we made a decision that I either needed to find a new job that would let me be at home more, or we needed to move closer to work. And so we got to looking for jobs and found the work from home job from Fog Creek Software. I was lucky enough to make it all the way through the interviewing process there and got that job. They were just in their initial stages of trying out remote. So they had an employee who they really valued. He had to move to Hawaii. It sounds like a hard have to move, but he had to move to Hawaii. They didn't want to lose him. So they allowed him to go remote and said, we'll try this and see if it works out. It was working well for him. And so they started hiring remote to try to flesh things out, because they found that one person being remote in a company of say 30, it means that one person has to do a lot of work to make sure that they're in the loop and that they're included in things. Whereas if you hire more and you get your ratio up, then it's much easier to work with the remote culture.
Great. So it sounds like it was really holding on to key talent that was the motivator, right? Whether it was yourself or other great engineers around you. So as you started that journey, and one became two became three, can you talk a little bit about some of the the processes or the changes that you had to make? Because it would be useful to share with the team on the call, because I think from my experience, there was always when we got started at my last company, there was an office, and then there was a bunch of remote engineers. And there was always like, hey, we're missing out on the water cooler talk, or hey, how do we stay more connected? And So I think it would be really great to just kind of share a little bit about what was the maturation process as you started to scale up the idea of a distributed team.
Yeah, that water cooler talk is a really hard one. And that's one that we focused on a lot. So when we were, before I joined Fog Creek, the company had a very strong culture of everybody has catered lunch together every day. And so you'd get all the serendipitous conversations, and all of the water cooler talk would happen then, and a lot of good ideas would come out of that. And it's something that they didn't want to lose. So when you start going remote, you kind of necessarily have to lose that shared lunch, especially when you're working across time zones and people don't eat at the same time. And so there was a lot of talk of how do we replicate that? And we went through a lot of different iterations of trying things to replicate the shared lunch. And over time, we kind of realized you don't want to replicate the in-person experience. You want to kind of complement your remote experience with something that gives the same benefit. So it's like saying, I have a car that's missing a wheel, and you're trying to replicate that wheel with a wooden wheel. It's not going to work the same as a normal rubber wheel. What you want is to adapt it to the experience. So that may be just finding a different size of tire, which would let you work, but you know, the problem we had was trying to replicate things from in-person into remote. So one of the main tools we used for that was what we call Mr. Rogers. It's the idea of meeting your neighbor. And so we had a system where we would put everybody on there, would randomize it, and get between groups of 2 and 4. And it was just like, this month, your assignment is to go get together with your group and you talk about non-work stuff. And so you'd simulate, like, the benefit of that water cooler talk is that knowing non-work things about people ties them together better. You get better social cohesion. And so instead of trying to have people go to a water cooler to get that, we basically just assigned it and said, okay, this is your group, you go and talk. We don't care about what, but your assignment is go talk for half an hour once a month. This is your group for this month.
Yeah, so that's great. You know, I think there's a theme, building and trust, that has to be established in the beginning to really be successful. It's funny that you talk about, you know, trying to recreate lunch. You know, one of the things that we've done in my past is, you know, after the end of sprint demos, we would just have happy hour. Everyone would get on video, and everyone would go to their cooler, their, you know, refrigerator, get a beer or a soda or a drink of their choice, and we would play games virtually. We play, you know, we just talk, we just shoot the shit. And excuse my language, that was just like a really essential part of the team coming together, and also doing some form of celebration in an ad hoc way, and as, you know, the sprint wrapped up, if you will. So tell us a little bit more about some of, you mentioned Mr. Rogers. Are there other kind of tools and processes that you started to add on and started to build upon as the journey into more and more? And maybe if you could just characterize kind of at Trello today, is it 100% remote? Is it 60% remote as you sort of embarked on the journey?
So first off, your talk about everybody go get a drink of your choice. We did the same thing on Fridays. So in the office, they always had beer bash. You can stay Friday evening and socialize. Would do the same remotely, but you just get on a Zoom call and chat. But Trello today, engineering, I think, is about 70, maybe 80% remote. Trello as the product as a whole, we're closer to 60%. And that is people who are not in any Atlassian office. So before Trello was acquired by Atlassian, our our home office was in New York. And now that we've been acquired, anybody who is close to an Atlassian office goes to work there. Typically, there are a few exceptions even to that. But outside of any of the offices, we're about 70% remote in engineering. On the road to becoming remote at Fog Creek, one thing we did was we recognized that the in-person conversations and interactions are very important. And so we said everybody's first week is always in office. It doesn't matter what else is going on. Just if it's somebody's first week, that person is in office and at least one person from their team. So for those teams that are completely remote, nobody in the office, that always have to fly somebody in. But even those teams where they do have one person in the office would still usually fly somebody in. And that way you can start to build that trust and that rapport between the new employee and at least one person on the team. Because like you were saying, the trust is very key to being able to work remotely well. And so with some time, as we were bringing people in one at a time for these first weeks, we also kind of realized the people who aren't coming in, they're kind of missing out on something. And so we started implementing a once a year, you get all of the team together for an offsite or an onsite, because we'd typically go to New York. Just getting that face-to-face time was incredibly important to trusting the people you work with.
Yeah, absolutely. So, onboarding is critical. I think just thinking about Andela and the way that we deliver our service by way of remote engineers, we take it very seriously. We send people on site for the first 2 weeks at their company, wherever that company is, to ensure that they build the cohesion of the team, and then we onboard them and we make sure that they're following all the right steps to get plugged in terms of Slack channels and various other processes. But that onboarding experience is critical, and doing it in person at the beginning makes sense. And just like any relationship, you have to work on it, right? And so the idea of meetups, we and my prior company was called Sony, and it was acquired by Barracuda Networks. We would have each Scrum team would come. There would be one sort of Scrum team meetup per quarter, and then there would be an all company meetup, at least depending on the circumstances. So you definitely want to work on relationship. So as you started to get remote work and distributed work established, there's one topic that I wanted to explore with you, and that is like, how did you get management on board? There's a lot of skepticism around people you can't see. Are they working? Are they mountain biking all day long and just kind of doing the minimum to get their work done? And I'll share an experience and I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you got management on board. But when I was at this company, Sony, and we had a new CEO come in about halfway through my tenure, and he had never worked with remote, had been an engineer in previous lives, hadn't been a part of it, and was skeptical from day one. I don't see these people. What are they doing? How do I know that things are getting done? And of course, we would have, product releases and we would show demos and things like that, but there was still something skeptical. And I remember we were having a management offsite, and I was in the repos for every engineer to be like, okay, how many submissions do they do? And like, are there better ways? And so one of the ways to get this CEO on board was to start to use data to show, submissions by engineer and their work that was getting done. And then also setting up like some skip level meetings where the engineers would I would set up meetings where each engineer would meet with the CEO just to like, okay, this is the person behind that body of work and all these commits to the repo. And so those were a couple things that we used. Like data was an important part, and then also like helping build that connective tissue with the CEO. And I'm curious, what are some of the things that you've done to kind of get management kind of bought on and on the journey?
Yeah, I think what you're talking about is very key. The words that I'd use are trust but verify. So you need that manager or the upper management to be able to trust that the people are doing what they're supposed to. And what you did with your data is you set up a mechanism to verify. So you allowed them, you said, I understand that you might not trust us completely. Here's a way to verify. And then you also set up the skip levels, which the face-to-face interactions help build that trust. I think that's a great traditional way to do it. The way that management at Fog Creek and Trello became comfortable with remote work, it was a little bit different. So I was a remote employee when I got hired on at Fog Creek, just a remote developer. And then we really only had one manager in engineering, and he left the company about 2 months after I started. And so then we need to decide, okay, who's going to lead the team? And we kind of looked around the team, and it came down to me and one other person. And we decided, well, I'll go ahead and lead the team since I have an MBA. And so it's just kind of like leading by default. I kind of fell into the manager role there. And so instead of taking a manager who was in office and working with remote employees, we just took one of the remote employees and made him manager. And he's remote, so he kind of has to trust that the remotes are working. So we kind of went about it a kind of a backwards way, which isn't going to work for most people. But when you look at the trust and verify model, I think the way that you guys did it is great. One other thing I would say about management being able to trust the individual contributors is it helps if you have managers who have a technical background. So even today, I as a manager know what it takes to program. I've been there, I've done that, I've done all sorts of projects. And so I look at a project that one of my people is working on, and I can give a rough estimate based on my knowledge of how I would build that and what I know about our product. And if they give me a similar estimate, great, I'm going to trust it. If they give me a different estimate, I'm going to ask questions, say, where are our understandings different, and figure out what the difference is there, so that I then can trust it because I know that they've thought through it enough. And so having a manager who is willing to talk about problems, like willing to talk about differences of understanding, is really going to help you overcome that trust issue.
Great. So, we're sort of going through the journey, right, of how did we get started? How do we get management on board? Now, as sort of the journey continues and you start to mature, I think it would be useful to share with people thoughts on tools and processes. And, have you found certain things that are critical? I think we're using Zoom right now. I think that's an important element. I know that there was an allergic reaction to video at first with some engineers, and do you make it mandatory at your company? And those are some processes and things like that. I'm curious if you could share with the audience how you think about important tools to support the distributed environment.
We do require the use of Zoom. So we've, over my time being remote, we've used a bunch of different tools, and I have not found any that is nearly as good as Zoom. Stability is one thing, features is another. Just one little pro tip that I love giving people: if you go into the settings, the preferences, and you turn on the always show people's names, then it will show a little icon of a microphone that's crossed out whenever somebody's muted. We actually use that as a way to like lean forward in your seat when you're about to speak. So if you're in a meeting with your team, 5 to 10 people, most everybody is muted except whoever's speaking. And then if you want to say something, you unmute. And that kind of gives you this little subtle clue of, oh, somebody's leaning forward like they want to say something. And so you'll finish what you're saying and let them speak. Just little pro tip there that actually makes a big difference. But go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask, I think it's great. I mean, I know some companies that sort of have a wall of monitors where everyone's on Zoom when they come into the office, right? And like everyone's on video, just like if you were sitting at your desk. And when you get up to go to the bathroom or go to lunch, like you see an empty chair. And so that's one like end of the spectrum. And you have to find what works for your team. And so I think it's great that you're sharing some tips. I'm curious about like information exchange as well for tools. Like, when you're a small team and you're all huddled around the same IKEA desk that you went and bought for, as you're working in the garage, so to speak, the proverbial garage, you have these high bandwidth conversations, and knowledge and information sharing is fast, right? And I'm curious, how do you think about, or how do you kind of get collaboration out? Zoom is important for video and conferencing and having conversations, but whether it's product announcements or company updates, are there certain things that you use or do that you found really effective?
That is a lot harder. So any announcements we typically try to do through we call it a town hall. Some people all hands, just some meeting where you get everybody together, or it's recorded so that everybody who isn't there at the same time can watch it later. But you just can't beat visual and audio communication for bandwidth. There's no way that you can write some blog post or some web page and say, here's a bunch of stuff, go and read it, because people are just going to tune out. They're not really going to read it. So as far as communicating important things with everybody, you just can't beat audio video. So we've never found anything that can work as well as just a town hall or something like that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, that's important, high bandwidth. I mean, I think one of the things you have to think about in a distributed environment is the synchronous communications and the asynchronous communications. One best practice to ensure more synchronous communications is to have the remote engineers in closer time zones, right? I had an engineer who wanted to go to Japan to learn Japanese, and we gave him some bandwidth because he was really good, but we just found it was too far away. He was 12 hours out of phase, and we had production problems that we were waiting on, and it just got really tenuous. And, for instance, at Andela, we guarantee 5 hours of overlap for the working day of any customer we work with, because we know that that's really important to be part of those stand-ups, to be part of that synchronous communication. And so, I think that's a good practice, is to try to find the overlap for the working days. In terms of like asynchronous communications, there's always things like Slack and things like that. One of the things that we've been exploring and using a little bit more is, just some recorded video, using a tool like Loom, for instance, to, hey, let me just tell you the thoughts in my head as I explain this concept, and you can react to it. Because people, like you said, don't want to read lots of long blog posts, but consuming video is a little bit easier. And so that's another way to kind of share kind of the asynchronous communication a little bit better. Are there other things that you would want to share with the group of some of the things that you're doing?
Just like to reinforce the overlap time. We only require 4-hour overlap, but overlap time is huge to actually being able to communicate as a team. We haven't done anything where you just go and record a video and then post it. That is an interesting idea, and I'll probably end up playing with that. But another thing that I think helps on the team level is we have private chat rooms for each team that we lock down to just those team members and no one else. I am extremely vigilant and what's the right word? I enforce that very strongly. Sometimes my manager or somebody else outside the team will say, hey, well, let me into your team room. And I say no, because that's where we trust each other a lot more. And we don't want somebody who we don't know how they're going to respond. We don't want them to come in. So we've seen times when one of, like we have product engineering and design on the team. And when one of the three of us has to go on leave for a long time, like I had a child born, 7 months ago, so I was on parental leave. And so during that time, somebody else ends up coming into the chat room, and they're not trusted because they're not at all of the offsites. They're not in the weeds with everybody else. So having that private area where people can mess up, where people can be silly and nobody looks down on them. That's also a key thing to being able to communicate like that. So instead of having the Loom videos where we just speak and say, here's my brain dump, we'll put a brain dump down into that locked down room. And at that point, it's like, I trust all of you to not throw me under the bus for all of this. And you all know that this is not set in stone. It's very fluid. And so we can talk about it.
Yep. Great. So I recognize that we have an audience of about 100 people and that questions are starting to build up. And so we're going to get there. I'm going to just ask a couple more questions and then we'll open it up to Q&A because we certainly want to be responsive to that. Brett, I think, one of the things that I wanted to just ask you about are there any pitfalls or like lessons that you've learned the hard way that, you might want to way to look at it? Is there, like, you've given some pro tips of like using Zoom that you want to share with the audience as well. But I think we can learn from failure, of course. And I'm curious if there's anything there that you want to share.
One of the less obvious things that I learned the hard way is we instituted a policy of if anyone's remote, everyone's remote. And this gets difficult if you're in a workplace with just desks or cubicles where everybody can hear all the conversations. It's easier in a workplace, like in shared spaces that have walls. But the thing that we found is when I first became manager at Fog Creek, I was in meetings with the founders and with other people who were in office, but I was remote. And so usually it'd be like a bunch of people in a conference room and I'm up on the wall, or maybe me and one other person. And after a few months of that, I kept getting comments from the founders that were like, we know that you have good ideas, but you never speak up. And so we kind of looked into it and realized that the video delay of just 50 or 100 milliseconds from one side to the other and then the same back meant that when somebody stopped talking in the conference room, I would recognize it about 100 milliseconds later and then start talking. And in the meantime, somebody in the conference room had already started talking without that delay. And then the start of my comment gets to the conference room another 100 milliseconds later. And then they feel like I'm trying to talk over them and I feel like I'm interrupting them. And so just subconsciously, that short delay caused me to think, I'm not going to say anything unless there's a longer pause. And so I would not say anything unless there was a pause of maybe half a second or more, just trying to wait for people to finish their conversations and their thoughts. So the way we solved that was to give everybody the same handicap. It's, if one person's remote, they're going to be at a disadvantage. So everybody needs to be at the same disadvantage. And so everybody's dealing with the same delays. And that's when we realized, oh, you can use the microphone mute thing as a clue of this person wants to talk, and makes conversations go smoother, even though everybody's got that penalty of the delay.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. The idea of leveling the playing field for everyone so that no one's at a disadvantage. It's a great pro tip. So I want to ask just one last question around those kind of pro tips. I'm curious, and I'll share a little bit of a story. Is there anything special you do for remote workers to keep them engaged? And maybe I'll just share one anecdote from my past. I had an engineer who I worked with in Brazil, and he would never go on video. And I'm like, why don't you go on video? And he's like, I can't. I'm like, just go on video. He's like, I can't. And we finally got to the heart of it. He was in his apartment in Sao Paulo. He had his shirt off. He was too hot, and he was embarrassed to go put a shirt on. It was too hot, and he didn't want to go on video. So it got me thinking, look, he needs a little bit of support. And so one of the things that we implemented was sort of a remote home office stipend. And so I was like, here's a couple $100, go buy an air conditioner. And so we started to do that with remote engineers, just like you have office upgrades at your own company, headquarters probably, we should think about the same for remote engineers. And so that was something that we implemented, just recognizing that. And I'm curious if you've done similar things or other things that, kind of keep the morale high and keep people engaged.
Absolutely. I love that. When I started at Fog Creek, they actually had a policy of if you're working remote, then we'll buy you a sit-stand desk, the motorized one, and we'll get you a nice Aeron chair so you don't have to worry about sitting all day, but you provide the space. And so I absolutely love that policy. Atlassian has backed off of that a lot. So I think this is one of those areas where you can really make a competitive advantage in the workforce. So if you offer home office upgrades, then employees recognize the value of those, and they're more likely to come to you instead of someone else. All else being equal, and even some things being unequal. But if you're willing to say, yeah, your office or your home is too hot, we will pay for air conditioning for you because we want you to be productive. We want you to have that team cohesion that only comes from having your video on. We want all of this stuff for you.
That's right. That
is going to be a huge competitive advantage for holding on to that employee and for getting others who might be in a similar situation. Absolutely love the idea of building out somebody's home office. It's not going to cost the company a ton, and it means, I guess the way to say it is, it means a lot more to the employee than it does to the company.
Sure. Absolutely. Okay, so we've done a lot of banter back and forth. Let's open it up to the people that have been asking questions. So a lot of questions have come in, and maybe we'll start with VJ, who is asking about, hey, we have mostly an in-person headquarter and one remote office location. Do you have any thoughts on shifting? On introducing a shift to the distributed fully remote culture, if it's only the engineers or only the product engineering teams that do this? How successful can it be with the rest of the company is in person and the tech team is remote? Do you have any thoughts on that, Brett? I can certainly share some thoughts as well.
Yeah, I think that within, you look at the level of communication that needs to happen between people. So you take a team, like an engineering team, let's include product and design, because that's how we look at things at Atlassian. You take that team, the communication between those members is very high. And so you cater things to that group and pay less attention to the rest of it. So our team is fully remote. We don't have any two people in the same location. We actually have two people on the team, both in the city of Austin, Texas, but they both primarily work from home. One of them occasionally goes into the office, but we look at them as being completely remote. And so we cater things to that group and then say the rest of the company will deal with as needed, but communication between our team and say sales or marketing or support, those communication lines are less important because they're less frequent. You don't need as much knowledge transfer between those. And so we kind of downplay the cross-team communications in favor of the within a team communications. So I think it's perfectly fine to say our team is remote. Everybody else doesn't have to be, as long as you get buy-in from management and all that. But our team is remote. Everybody else can be in office, and we'll work with that communication line as needed.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think you want to take anything away from people who enjoy going into the office, right? Some people need that social engagement or that interaction or be around other workers, and you don't want to take that away from people who want that. I do think it's important that if you have remote workers that you encourage them to get into a routine, get up and shower, start your day at 9 o'clock or whatever it is and get into a routine. That's how you keep people, thinking that it's regular, right? Like, I think I made reference to, I remember interviewing a guy who thought he could go mountain biking all day long and he would, work late at night. Like that's not what we were looking for in a remote worker. Okay, so the next question was, how do you keep employees feeling accountable?
The best thing that I know of to do is actually just let them make decisions. Let them make suggestions. So on our team, I work very closely with the product manager, and we will typically come up with the short list. And it's like, these are the 4 or 5 projects that we need to get to most quickly. That'll have the biggest impact. And maybe we also have an alternate list of these are the top 5 bugs that we need to deal with. But then during our planning meeting, which we're actually going to be doing in less than 2 hours, we'll sit down and say, okay, let's lay out who's working on what, and then who has bandwidth coming up, who's rolling off of one of their projects. And when somebody's rolling off, it's like, this is our list, our short list. What do you want to work on? And what do you think, or is there something that's not on here that you think is more important? And then let's discuss that. But if you can get people to be intrinsically motivated, so I just motivate myself to do something because that's what I want to do, you don't really have to worry too much about accountability. So the problems come when you're asking people to do things that they don't want to do, or that they think are less useful, and you're asking them to execute on those things when they don't really want to do it. So that's when you have to check in on the accountability front. If they can motivate themselves and you can find ways to do that, the accountability problem pretty much goes away.
Right. Great. So we have a question from Barry asking about team distribution. I think we covered this in terms of time zone difference. I think, Brett, you guys sort of employ a 4-hour gap. At Andela, we ensure 5 hours of overlap. I think something you want to account for, that those synchronous communication, stand-ups, things like that, planning, sprint planning, things like that. So I think that's a good best practice.
The
Yeah,
furthest we've gotten on time spread is in one team from Sweden to Hawaii. And that was a big spread. So we would have our Hawaii person would get up early. He liked to work early, very much a morning person. He'd work early and finish his day by about 1 o'clock and then go surfing before he went and picked up his kids from school. But then the person in Sweden was more of a night owl and would wake up around noon, and then just start his day later and work until about midnight and then be done for the day. And both of those people were able to do their overlap time just at different sides of their day. So you can make a bigger time spread than 3 hours of difference. You can make that work. You just have to find the right people for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we have some other questions coming in, and if people want to sort of talk live, please feel free. I'm sort of going in sort of chronological order. Maybe I'll jump around a little bit since we're growing short on time. But if people have something urgent that they want to ask, please feel free to hop off of mute and ask if that is possible with the Zoom. So we have a question here about how do you get ICs comfortable with having a remote manager? Brett, I think you've been in that situation. Anything you want to share there?
Just be very involved and also make those connections, make the connections outside of work context. So I start all of my one-on-ones just by asking how life is going. And we just talk about whatever for at least the first 5 minutes. I always have different things that I keep top of mind that we can use as conversation during one-on-ones. But having the little more social connection is helpful. Another thing that I do is I actually put myself up as someone to be made fun of. So we joke about different aspects of my life or different things going on with me, and people they feel free to kind of poke fun at me when there's something ridiculous or really funny in my life, and I just put that up for free for everybody in our locked down room, and that makes people more free to be themselves, be silly in that room, and also it gets them a feeling of I'm not going to come down real hard on them if they say the wrong thing. That they know that I'm human and I recognize the same in them.
Yeah, I think just because you're remote still means you're human, right? And so you want to have that connection and be available to them. So there's a question in here that's maybe directed at me around Andela. It says, any ways to improve retention of remote team members, particularly when they work non-directly for you, like through a company like Andela? Yeah, I think, look, we all want to grow. We all want to develop ourselves. We all want to learn new things. And I think if you are managing an engineer who's remote and maybe they don't work for you directly, I think if you can continue to challenge them and have conversations around how do you want to grow, what are things that you want to learn, and look for avenues to provide that is important. I think we in the engineering community know that salary and comp is one thing to motivate, but like solving hard problems and learning and growing are higher order things that people look for. And so maybe just to answer that question from Gary. Okay, what else do we have on here? And Brett, feel free if you want to look at any of these and cover any of them that makes sense. Let's jump around a little bit. This is from Tim. We're a remote first company, 25 people. We don't have an office. How can we scale and maintain our culture when we become 100? Can we stay 100% remote at 300?
It's real easy to stay 100% remote. Just never declare a home office. but yeah, there are some companies that are big scale and fully remote. The main thing, I think, the main key to that, in my opinion, is have your managers be fully bought into the culture. So culture is often defined by what's allowed and what's not, and just make sure that everybody understands what the culture is and that remote working is a part of it. And then I don't think you'd have a problem maintaining that remote culture as you grow.
Yeah, and I think, look, it's really important to kind of write down the important parts of your culture and what you value, and like make sure that's clear when someone's onboarded. You talk through those things and set expectations. So that's good stuff. Gilead has a question about how do you convey a sense of urgency with remote workers? That's an interesting question.
Give them all of the information they need to come to that conclusion on their own. So if I want people to understand that, hey, this bug that we've got is really urgent, then I say, this is going to be the impact if we don't fix this. And everybody on my team understands that I have a different perspective. They're looking, if I use the trees and forest analogy, the individual contributors are generally looking at a tree or a few trees. I'm looking more across the forest. And so I can give them guidance of, hey, if we don't fix this thing, then all of these other dominoes are going to fall as well. This is going to be the outcome of it. And once you can lay out that case of this is what happens if we don't do this, as long as your reasoning makes sense, then I've never had a problem with them feeling the urgency as well.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple points that you sort of raised in there to maybe just highlight. The idea of transparency is critical with a remote team, right? There is no water cooler, there is no hallway conversation. So being more transparent is really important, and being transparent about the things that are like urgent and highly critical, and it's a production down problem and we need you guys all pulling together to fix it. You like, just be clear. And I think what goes without saying there is also the idea of communication. Like, you do need to work a little bit harder at communication with a remote team, whether it's writing more in terms of direct messages and Slack, or getting on Zoom calls, or having a little bit more bandwidth to create communication and being transparent around that. So I think we covered that from Gilead. Roland has a 3-part question here. I'm concerned about the lack of tooling that really supports distributed development. For example, cloud-based continuous delivery is starting to become mature easily. Cloud-based IDEs and 100% cloud-based environment for a developer, not so much. My developers continue to waste thousands of hours creating development ecosystems on their laptops and then debugging why nothing works when they push changes to the CD system.
I think that one, we're just talking about a maturing industry. So waiting on that one, I know it's not a great answer for right now, but a couple of interesting things I've seen. Let's see, what do they call it? Glitch is kind of a web or cloud-based IDE. You've also got Nanobox, which is much smaller, but it's kind of a containerized system. I see those both going on the right path. I don't know how many other small ones there are, but I think that industry, or that part of the industry, will mature.
Yeah, getting the tool chain that you need for development kind of defined and easy to install. It's worth, putting some investment and having some engineers spend some time getting that in place so that new people coming on board can get up to speed quicker. But yeah, there's definitely pain around that. There's also questions around sort of multilingual, right? If you're thinking distributed and remote and moving into other countries, how do you think about tools for bridging the communication gap, whether, around language.
Multilingual is just hard. I don't see any real breakthroughs coming in that area in the near future. Because if you say that part of the benefit of working in an office is that communication bandwidth is very high, then you go to remote and that bandwidth becomes lower, and then you add the hurdle of we're not actually using the same words. It's just making it very difficult. I agree, it would be a lot better world if we didn't have that hurdle, or we could easily go over it. But still, the best tools we have are statistics based, and those are not great for translating things, at least anything that needs to be translated with details. And then tools for software architecture and design, that I don't know. I don't see anything coming around there either, other than you get somebody really smart who's already made the mistakes.
Right. Okay, so I'm just looking at the clock. We're about a minute to go, and there's still a lot of answers in the questions in the queue. And I apologize that we didn't manage our time wisely to get through a lot of these, but hopefully we've touched on lots of different things here. Mustafa, do you want to maybe speak to how to wrap this up and be sensitive, and maybe there's some thoughts on answering some of these questions offline or something like that?
Yeah, for sure. So first of all, David and Brett, really appreciate your time and sharing your insights on how to build and how to lead a remote first team and company. And so for kind of next steps, I want to say there's a lot of really great questions. So we'll follow up with Brett and David, and even talk to some of our other mentors so that everyone feels like their question has been answered. And we'll actually be recording and kind of making sure we track the questions that everyone has submitted. So we'll get you answers. So everyone who's listening in who has submitted a question, we'll make sure we get you an answer as soon as possible. We don't want you to feel like you haven't gotten your question answered. So so we'll follow up. So our team at Plato will follow up with everyone who asked a question. Again, thank you to everyone who who listened in. And again, good luck to everyone hopefully everyone has received some really good tactical insights that they can use their day-to-day with their teams. And we'll also announce kind of the next webinar, the next Ask Me Anything session soon over email. So I want to thank Brett, I want to thank David and Della and everyone for listening, and we'll follow up with answers to your questions, and hope everyone has an awesome rest of their day.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you, everyone.
Cheers, everyone.